Well, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Strategic Farming. Let's talk crops. I'm Ryan Miller. I'll be your moderator today. Welcoming everyone in. Today's topic, we're going to be focused on climate factors and nitrogen management. So we're going to try to limit the discussion to that. I know there's a lot of interest in biologicals in nitrogen management. I'd encourage you to come back in 2 weeks. February 8th, we'll be having a session on that topic in particular. So we're really going to focus around, current weather observations and climate and how that's influencing nitrogen management in the state. And so for that discussion, we've got on two people with us today, Dan Kaiser, nutrient management specialist in St. Paul, and Brad Carlson, a crops and water educator in southern Minnesota, who's been focused quite heavily on nitrogen management. So two people to kind of help facilitate the discussion today. Today's session has been brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension, as well as some generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Corn Research and Promotion Council. So thanks to those folks for providing some support today. As in the past, this is going to be a discussion-oriented program, so we're going to have a little bit of a primer, introduction here, some slides for 20 or 30 minutes or so, and then we'll break into the discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it over. I think, Brad, you wanted to launch things off here today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. We're going to talk a little bit today about changes that need to be made in management depending on what the climate conditions are. We have a advanced nitrogen smart session that we cover this as a topic. It actually is about 3 hours. And so we obviously don't have time to go through that full thing. And I encourage folks who are interested to attend that if that's of interest to you. What we cover in that session is a lot of information pertaining to a lot of situations, just so you have the knowledge going forward. And what we'll talk more about today is kind of more specific to what this year looks like. And so I do have a few slides that I'm going to put up that are gleaned from that presentation. I do want to put in a plug, though, that our advanced nitrogen smart sessions, we already had one at Ag Expo last week, but we'll get rolling with these starting next week on January 31st, February 1st. We're going to offer what we call Nitrogen College, which is all 4 of our advanced sessions in one place over 2 days. There's no cost to attend, no pre-registration required, and that's thanks, of course, to the generous support of Minnesota Corn. But the 4 sessions include manure management, morning of the first day, what we call a deep dive into the 4 R's, the afternoon of the first day. Morning of the second day, we'll talk about adjusting nitrogen to climate, which is the topic today, of course. And then in the afternoon on the second day, we've got one on reducing nitrate loss to water. This year, we are offering CEUs. We've been pre-approved for those. And so if somebody attended the full 2 days, you'd get 6 nutrient management credits and 6 soil and water credits. And so anyway, that's just a little plug on that. So I am going to pull up this slide set now. We were having a few issues because my computer was being weird going between my laptop and my monitors. So hopefully this works.
And Brad, I just want to take a moment and mention, I did put a link to the landing page for Nitrogen Smart. And so all of those offerings that Brad just mentioned, you can land there and find out more details on topics and dates and locations and such. So that's over in the chat if you can open that up, and folks can feel free to put that in their browser and look at it later.
Yeah, and so let's see here. Let me start screen sharing and let's see if we can make this work. So when we talk about nitrogen and climate, really the factors that are most important are probably temperature and water, in terms of soil moisture specifically, and excess soil moisture. And I start this slide to look at I think a lot of people have seen this before, the 30-year averages at Waseca at the Research and Outreach Center. showing how they've changed over the years. For those of you who aren't familiar, we look at what we consider average precipitation by taking the average amount over a 30-year block of time. They don't reset annually, they reset every 10 years. So every 10 years, we drop off the oldest 10 and add the most recent 10. And so, like for instance, now we're using the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, and we won't add the 2020s until 2030, and then we'll drop off the 1990s. But you can see that we've had this trend towards greatly increasing precipitation, almost 10 inches more on our 30-year average now than there was in 1960. And so there's really obviously going to be variation from one year to the next, but we do need to be thinking about that we do have a lot of excess water in the landscape now that we didn't used to have, and that while that has implications all over the place, I guess particularly we're talking about nitrogen management. If you look at it, that was the Waseca numbers. If you look at it across the state, this is the current 30-year average here on the left visual. However, we can see the, oops, didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. How's that? We can see the, just the last 10 years though, on the right side. And so particularly, I think most of us realize that the last 10 has been especially wet. And so that really has a lot of more implications in the near term. Now, of course, the last 2 years were kind of dry. Maybe that's going to push these back towards maybe towards the figure on the left a little more. But with it being as wet as it was the last decade, that's obviously something we need to be thinking about when we make decisions on what products we're using and when we're making applications. This is a figure that we've used a lot. Giles Randall put this in a publication many years ago, and it just simply shows the yellow bars are precip falling from the sky, the red bars are water moving through the drain tile, and then the line in the middle is corn growth, and it shows how as we get into the growing season and the corn starts using water, while we're continuing to receive increased amounts of precipitation, the amount leaving the system decreases greatly because of crop use. And I guess that's intuitive to most people. I guess the thing we really need to think about with this, though, is how the excess prior to the growing season affects nitrogen loss and nitrogen movement transformation on site if we've already made our nitrogen fertilizer application. And so particularly, again, the excess is what we're concerned about because it's potentially either going to leach into the drain tile or it is going to saturate the soil and drive denitrification. If you look at, here's some numbers where we take the precipitation and we subtract the amount of evapotranspiration during the year, during the growing season, I should say. That shows us how much surplus precip we have during the growing season. And the figure I've got on the left is 1961 to 1990. The figure in the middle is the current one, and then the figure on the right is one looking at just the last 10 years, which again shows how extremely wet it's been all the way across southern Minnesota during the last decade. What's significant about the one on the left? Well, the one on the left was what it was at the time nitrogen best management practices were first developed in 1994. That was what we were using to base those on. And so if we think about the fact that we created separate zones in south central Minnesota and southwest Minnesota, you can kind of see that from that map. However, if you look at the maps in the middle and then on the right, you can also see how really the south central and southwestern part of the state have pretty well collapsed onto each other as far as how they're behaving precipitation wise. And so from a nitrogen management perspective, we've been pretty inclined to say southwest Minnesota probably needs to be managed in the same way we manage south central Minnesota, particularly when it comes to not using urea in the fall, and also with the benefits of using a nitrification inhibitor with anhydrous ammonia applications in the fall. The data, the climate data really shows or justifies that. Getting into some numbers here, typically water storage on a 3-foot soil profile is somewhere between 10 to 12 inches of water. That's what we would consider field capacity. Sandy soils hold probably less than 5 inches. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today because obviously that's getting into irrigation management, and that's just a completely different topic. Typically, saturation doesn't last for very long, especially with most of our farm fields having a lot of tile drainage these days. We don't see that for very long, but we can usually assume that at some point in the spring, the soil is completely saturated. I think most farmers recognize that at some point you got standing water. Most places it's extraordinarily muddy. And so from there, we can think about just a back of the envelope water budget. If you figure that that at that point we have 10 to 12 inches of water being held, you can start thinking about how much water is going away on a daily basis as far as evaporation. Once the crop gets growing, how much is going away from transpiration that the crop is using. And we can also think about how much we're adding from it falling from the sky. We can think about how much we're subtracting by taking away from drain tile. And we can start getting a little bit of a picture of what's happening as far as soil conditions and how it might be impacting nitrogen. Now that's getting to a level of complexity that most producers don't want to engage in, and that's fine. However, it's worth at least thinking about that's what's going on out there, and that's what's impacting the nitrogen that you applied. This is kind of a rule of thumb because it really gets down to a lot of factors on site that are very difficult to measure or determine without going in and measuring specifics on site. But for the most part, we figure that if we have 1 inch of drainage, we're moving nitrate about 5 to 6 inches. In our heavier soils, about a foot in sandy soil. Again, we're not going to talk a lot about the sandy stuff, but you can start thinking about 5 to 6 inches. If you did a nitrogen application, it takes an inch to move it that far. How deep is your drain tile? If it's 3 feet or if it's 4 feet, how much excess precip beyond saturation is required to actually start leaching nitrogen out of the soil. It's one of the factors that we consider when we look at total nitrogen loss out of drain tile, and we see that a lot of it's happening in May and June. We know just simply based on the water budget and the way nitrogen behaves that that's probably not applied fertilizer. It's probably mineralized nitrogen from the previous fall because there just simply hasn't been enough water to move applied fall nitrogen. First, it would have had to convert to nitrate, and then it would have had to have had this much extra. We're talking about 6 inches of free water drainage here to get it to move all the way to the drain tile, and so that does give us a little piece of evidence for that. In general, our drainage systems in southern Minnesota are designed to what we would call a half-inch drainage coefficient. In a lot of cases lately, a lot of drainage systems have been not really designed so much as guys are putting in tile based on experience. This is about how far apart it seems to work best. In that case, someone probably would need to go backwards and look at the design and then calculate the drainage coefficient. But if you're starting from a clean field that has no tile and you design it, what a half-inch drainage coefficient means is it'll take away a half an inch of water in 24 hours. So if it's completely saturated and it rains an extra inch, it takes it about 2 days to get rid of it. Most people know this, but it's worth pointing out that extra tile does not drain more water. It will only leave through drain tile as long as it's free in the soil or above field capacity. More tile just simply drains it faster. It'll drain pretty much the same amount of water, but it moves it faster. It doesn't drain any more. And so we don't really need to worry about if we have a lot of extra tile. We still are draining the same amount. Is just happening in a lot faster time frame. So, again, takes about 48 hours. If it drains an additional inch, takes about 2 days to get rid of that. We know though that tile doesn't flow at capacity for very long, where it's running like a fire hose. But farmers can take a look at how water is flowing out of an outlet and kind of determine how much, how close to design capacity the water is flowing, and get a feel for how much water, if you knew how much fell from the sky, about how much water we're probably moving and what the fate of the nitrogen was from that. So what this means, if you want to go all the way down to this, takes about, if you applied nitrogen at 6 inches deep, it converted to nitrate, it takes about 5 inches of excess precip or excess drainage in order to get the nitrogen all the way out of a drain tile. That's 10 days flowing at full capacity. That pretty much never happens. And so from that standpoint, we don't usually look at losing lots of applied nitrogen in season. It's usually stays within the rooting depth of corn. It's really the fall applications we worry about, or if you did an application of a product that's subject to move, like urea in the fall, this is why it can actually, that we can't actually see it go out during this period of time. What's typical? This is some data from the Research and Outreach Center in Lamberton. Shows that, on average, we move 4 to 9 inches of water, depending on the cropping system during a growing season. These are 4-year totals on this chart, so divide them by 4. And so, yeah, it does exceed that 5 inches. However, you have to remember that a lot of that's happening prior to the growing season. We get a lot of discharge happening in March and April before we've planted. So that's not necessarily coming in contact with applied fertilizer in a lot of cases. And this kind of just shows that seasonality of that. Now, one of the concepts that we get concerned about is in a very dry year, like we've had the last 2 years, we typically carry over nitrates in the soil. It's either unused by a crop that didn't reach its full potential because of the drought, or because we tend to move a lot of mineralized nitrogen that's accumulating post-growing season. That's what the data kind of indicates based on the numbers we showed, that it's not necessarily the fertilizer that's applied. It's either leftover nitrogen or mineralized nitrogen from the fall. In a dry year, that doesn't happen. It just sits in the soil. And so if you can actually look at this inverse relationship between the Palmer Drought Severity Index and the nitrogen load in the Minnesota River where it enters the Twin Cities, you can see how those flip-flop back and forth. And so this last year, these last 2 years, with it being especially dry, we do look at there being a lot of proof that there's nitrate present in the soil. A little bit of evidence of that. You can see that on the chart on the left is from Lamberton from the early 1990s. You can see how high these nitrogen loss numbers are. These are 4-year totals, so divide these by 4 to get a yearly average. But then you can see on the one on the right, which is 2007 to 2010 from Waseca, we can actually see that these numbers are much lower. And so again, that's showing that drought effect like we experienced coming out of that drought of the late 1980s. Let's change gears, talk just a tiny bit. I'm just about done here. I talked a lot about water, but we know that temperature affects nitrification. We can actually figure that out as far as from the time we apply nitrogen in the fall and what the fate of that is, how much of that's converted to nitrate just based on time and temperature. I'm not going to get into detail about this, but it's worth just mentioning that this is something you can actually kind of figure out. And the other part of this is we can also kind of calculate denitrification also based on soil temperature. Both of these processes are biological. And so microbes do respond to temperature, just like we put food in the refrigerator to keep it from spoiling. Same thing happens out in your farm fields. That biological activity slows greatly when the temperature gets below 50 degrees. That's why we recommend not making fall nitrogen applications before the soil temperature gets to 50 degrees. But we do know that it does happen to some extent, that if you leave food in your refrigerator indefinitely, it will go bad. And so there is some activity at cold temperatures. It's just not very fast. Okay, so I'm just about done. I got 2 slides here. So one thing I want to point out, getting back to this issue of residual nitrogen. Friends at Minnesota Valley Testing Labs have been gracious to share with us the soil test data from their 0 to 24-inch soil samples these last 2 years. These are fall tests, and this shows the percentage of samples in these different categories based on our University of Minnesota recommendations. You can see that roughly 25 or so percent, 1/4, had no nitrogen credit. However, the last couple of years, we've exceeded 155 pounds nitrogen credit on anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the acres. Now, these are situations where we would expect to find a nitrogen credit, because I think that's probably why they took a soil sample and sent it in. So fields that are either corn on corn or fields that have a manure history, 155 pounds of nitrogen is a pretty significant credit. For that matter, anywhere from almost 20% last year to 13% this year, we're over 24 parts per million. Our recommendations don't go that high because this data was done at a time when nitrogen rates were a lot lower, recommended rates were lower than they are today. But I think we can speculate that if you're at 24, your credit's probably approaching 200 pounds per acre. With the price of nitrogen, this is pretty significant, and I would be looking at taking advantage of this. And so we do actually have data that shows that, yes, indeed, we have carryover nitrogen from this past year. These are 2022 samples. This is brand new numbers. I actually finished calculating these out yesterday afternoon. And so I guess the last thing about taking a soil nitrate test, if you're going to do that, is remember, we assume a background level of nitrogen that is 0 to 6. We give 0 credit for. And so we don't convert to pounds per acre, because when you do that, you're also adding in this 0 to 6, which is kind of what was already present when we did nitrogen rate trials. And so because we don't measure that and subtract it off from the rate trial, we don't do that when we take a soil test either. So we don't really want those numbers in pounds per acre. We just want to stay in parts per million, which is where the test was calibrated at. It's worth noting that the sugar beet growers use soil test numbers that are in pounds per acre. And so kind of be cautious of that. If you've got numbers that came from that type of a test, or if you inadvertently send it into the lab and that's what they think is going on, you're going to get back pounds per acre. That number is probably only 60% of what it came back to be as far as what you can actually credit in the field. So that kind of takes care of that. I know we wanted to talk about a few other things like side dressing and so forth, and I'm going to let I've been talking a long time. I'm going to let Dan kind of go too.
So yeah, encourage folks again, put some questions in the Q&A box, and so we can get to those. Dan, if you've got any comments, you could go ahead and make them. Otherwise, I've got a couple of questions that came to my mind for Brad, but it's up to you if you want to take the stage and make some comments.
Well, I don't have anything prepared. I figured I'd leave some time for questions. So yeah, if you've got questions, go ahead and start with those.
So you spent a lot of time talking about water, and I thought it might be interesting to kind of just talk about the two processes that water is driving as far as nitrogen loss. And then I'd like to jump back to your slide 16 there and look at that in relation to, talk about risk with that nitrate at those various depths and the residual nitrate levels. So.
Well, I don't know that I need to put the numbers back up there, but I guess it's worth saying that nitrate, because it's subject to be lost, it's subject to either leach or be denitrified. The numbers that were tested are real, but we need to be confident that nitrogen still is in the field at the time the crop needs the nitrogen. And so if you're going to use that credit, we do need to keep track of how much it's been raining between the time the test was taken and when the crop gets growing, to see if potentially we might have lost some of that nitrogen that we actually were crediting. And so that's one of the reasons why we don't recommend taking a fall soil nitrate test in the south central part of the state, although a lot of our data is kind of indicating it's just as wet all the way to the South Dakota border. So maybe in the future, we might be recommending not taking fall tests because it's very difficult to know whether they're going to still be accurate at planting time. But they do give us a good window on what actually happened post-growing season this last year.
So
Yeah,
go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, I'll make a comment on this too. I mean, I will reiterate those comments that Brad made too. I mean, the question on our end really is with those fall tests is the accuracy. So, normally that's why it was recommended in the western part of the state, because that earlier map that Brad showed with the precipitation minus evapotranspiration, that, typically if you look at the western part of the state, historically when the NBMPs were first made, that we always had where ET exceeded precipitation at some point where we wouldn't have as much risk for downward movement. So whatever nitrates there should be there from fall into the spring. So we're looking at that now. I mean, the issue is when you look at it, we need to probably take a wider look across the number of sites that when you start seeing, is it positive or negative in terms of what you're seeing in the spring versus what you see in the fall? Because I mean, it could happen both ways. And that's kind of been the issue, is the predictability of it going forward. So I know, there's always some apprehension, I know, from growers when you start talking about that, can you count on that? I know Dorian had a question talking, if we looked at the amount of residual nitrate versus applied nitrate, we've got a fair amount of data of that, just sampling in the fall on post-harvest on the on some of our N-rate studies. So we have a fair amount of that. The issue though is that is really dependent on nitrogen utilization. The other question always comes into play is how much do we normally carry over? And that's kind of where that crediting on that, I think it's Brad, 0 to 6 ppm is that lower category. That's where that comes in, because we normally assume there'd be probably around, if you multiply 6 by 4, that would be roughly 24 pounds. I mean, normally probably around 30 pounds that we should probably carry on a year-to-year basis. That's one of the things we're looking at right now, though, in terms of how those numbers are changing. So that's the issue with it, the unpredictability of it. If you look at the nitrogen cycle, there's just so many ways we can add and subtract that it's one of the reasons why we're kind of still in the same boat we're in with some of our guidelines, is that we're targeting a number, but we know there's a variability out there from field to field.
So if we look at those numbers that you had in the profile, are there any guidelines on how much precipitation before we start to see? I know you mentioned some level of free water and drainage to move, so many inches through the soil profile, but I mean, there's some room to take in moisture before there's loss, I would think. Is there any guidelines there? Or?
Well, I don't know that this is one of the reasons why we have the Nitrogen Smart training on this topic, because we don't really have printed guidelines, because every year is going to be a little different. So guys kind of have to have a feel for how this behaves, what the research shows and what the science shows, and then kind of get a feel for it, for what it's like during the year. We know last year that the soil profile saturated. We had a late delayed planting season because it was wet, which seemed really odd coming out of a dry year the previous year. If you look at that water budget, though, it wasn't in enough excess to actually drive a lot of loss. If it had stayed wet, that probably would have been a significant factor. I showed those numbers relative to denitrification and soil temperature. Typically speaking, if you look at the averages, at least at Waseca, and we like using Waseca because it's just a really complete long data set. We know there's going to be differences as you move north to south and from one year to the next. So you might as well just choose a point where you've got good data and then kind of decide how much different you are from that. But if you look at Waseca, typically the average date that we hit 50-degree soil temperature in the springtime is May 1st. And so denitrification loss is really quite insignificant when the soil temperature is cold. And so we wouldn't look at that early season, that saturated condition in March and April, as driving a lot of denitrification. Had it stayed really wet going into May and June, where typically the soil temperatures start getting towards 75 degrees in June, then it would have been extreme. And you can actually lose almost half your nitrogen in about 10 days if it stays really wet. This is pretty uncommon to stay saturated for 10 days. But we know because we've had research projects that we've where this has been pertinent. It has happened in the last decade where we've had that situation, and so guys do need to kind of be aware of that.
All right, so I did have a question come in here from Jeff Vetch down at Waseca, talking about how much N a cover crop can sequester. And I do want to make mention that on February 22nd, we're going to have a special episode right on cover crops and some of those questions. So we'll have a more in-depth discussion with Anna Cates and Matt Rourke on that particular topic. But if you wanted to address that, if you want to give us some ballpark numbers, or if you want to wait, we can just put it off and say, hey, come back on February 22nd.
It's kind of ironic that actually our new Nitrogen Smart curriculum is reducing nitrate loss to water, and I am actually putting together that part of that, and that's the one part of the presentation I haven't actually gotten all the numbers together. The main thing with cover crop sequestration of nitrogen, though, is going to be just a simple factor of growth of the cover crop versus the amount of nitrogen that's picked up. If you think about, a lot of farmers are familiar with the concept of crop removal of their crops. Same thing is going to apply for the cover crop, as far as if we can look at how much nitrogen is in that cover crop and how much it grew. Now it's going to be very difficult to know how much of that's below the ground as far as the root growth and what that might have picked up. But it's really that's really almost completely a factor of how much that cover crop grew. I don't think we've got good hard rules of thumb at this point, looking at total biomass and what we can expect for that. Now, the thing to remember is that's arresting the nitrate in site. It's picking it up and it's preventing it from being lost, leached, or denitrified. Theoretically, it is cycling itself back. And so if you had really good cover crop growth, technically you should be able to arrest a lot of that nitrate that we normally flush in April and May and June, and just keep it there to be released during the growing season. I don't think we're quite there yet.
And if you think about, most plants, the nitrogen concentration in the tissue is probably between 1% to 3%. So, for every ton out there, that would be, equate back to 20 to 60 pounds N per ton. So it's, I guess, something to kind of think about with that. So it's probably ballpark in that area. It's, as Brad said, it's all about the amount of biomass. Merely biomass directly relates to uptake. Concentration isn't as related. If you look at all of our data, it's always about the total biomass.
And ballpark biomass figures, you guys thinking about a half a ton average with rye, or
how long do you want to let it go? That's kind of the issue with rye. It's the longer you let it go, the more it's going to take up. But then that's kind of a double-edged sword, because then you start getting too much biomass out there. And what we found, at least in some of the early stages of just implementing cover crops in fields, this a year after we implemented it, that we're having more issues probably with nitrogen tie-up in that case, especially with letting the biomass get out of hand. So that's kind of the issue with it. There's a fine line in there, and that's probably something I'm guessing Matt will talk about, because I know he's got a lot of data on that. Matt Rourke does with that. But, we see the same thing with looking at iron deficiency chlorosis in soybean with an oat companion crop. Is you let it get to about 10 inches, and that's kind of about the max. You let it get beyond that, it starts to act like more like a weed in the field, where you have more competition with beans. So it's one of those things that's just a balancing act of getting enough out there to get enough uptake, but trying not to get too much out there where you have more other issues with the residue that's left behind.
Yeah, so come back February 22. We'll have a broader discussion, more in-depth discussion on cover crops and some of those things. So we didn't,
or come to the Advanced Nitrogen Smart session, and by next week in Wilmer, I'll actually have assembled that data into that presentation.
So Dan, a kind of question that comes to mind, we talk about nitrogen application. We're only, if you look at a corn crop, we're only applying as a fertilizer a certain percent of what's needed by the crop. What are some of the ballpark figures as far as fertilizer versus what's going to mineralize out of the soil? What are we providing in terms of our fertility management?
Well, normally when you look at just overall nitrogen use efficiency, we see probably at best about 40% of what you apply is taken up. Obviously that depends on the rate. The lower the rate, the more important the nitrogen is. So if we look at any like nitrogen use efficiency, it's typically if you look at it, it's a inverse linear relationship. So the most efficient amount that you put on is the first pound, and then it starts going down beyond that. Now I've seen some circumstances where it's more of a parabola. So it's kind of what it increases to a point and then it decreases. But that seems to be situations with high yield. And if we look at NUE right now, nitrogen use efficiency, I mean, really the thing that helps with that is really pushing for higher yields with the similar amount or with the same amount of N. See, the more we can push out of it with not having to apply extra N, will really increase it. Now, that's one of the things that, from a non-farm standpoint, somebody might say, well, if we're only looking at 40% of our N being taken up, where does that other 60% go? And it isn't necessarily that we're losing that. It's, that whole, if you look at that whole nitrogen cycle picture, we know that, I don't know, Brad, I mean, the stuff we say is probably 60 to 75% of our yield is just coming probably from the soil itself. That additional, whatever it is, that 60% could just be, simply cycling back into that whole machine that would come out within future years. So it's one of the things that, I hesitate when I talk about some of this stuff, when we start talking about nitrogen use efficiency, because if you don't understand the whole nitrogen cycle, I think you could kind of make that mistake in saying, farmers, if it's only 40% going into the plant, that 60% is being wasted, and that's not necessarily the case. So we know that that cycling is an important part. We know that denitrification generally is going to happen. You're probably going to see, at least about 5% of that nitrogen being lost by denitrification. But, when it comes down to it, if we're trying to keep it out of the surface water, I mean, denitrification isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, you can argue with some of the nitrous oxide stuff. That's not really what we're going to talk about today. But, yeah.
Kind of changing gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit, and a question just came in on this, but nitrogen source, so fertilizer source and loss potential, as well as some of the products that we can use to kind of help stabilize nitrogen in the environment and keep it there for when the crop needs it.
So one of the things that we talk about this more in, I think it's the deep dive section. Well, I think we talk about it both in deep dive and adjusting for climate sections, is the difference between anhydrous and urea. And we see, Minnesota right now, if you look at it, we're more of a urea dominated state. I think some of that comes from the fact that we've got if you look at us versus Iowa, we've got a much more diverse cropping system. So timings and all that, that's placement, those types of things. I mean, it's a lot different when you start adding all the crops in, especially with different planting windows, that, changes what is the optimal level to use. I mean, the issue with it, though, between the two is urea and anhydrous, they aren't the same thing. While they end up at the same point, typically, I mean, the plant, it's going to end up as nitrate, and that's what the plant's going to take up. It's getting to that point that's the issue. And the problem with urea is we have two loss pathways that typically come into play. One is volatilization, which it can happen with anhydrous, although if we're injecting it deep enough, that risk is low. I mean, simply it's just volatilization is the gassing off as ammonia. But urea is more problematic because that can happen over a slower period of time. And, particularly if you have shallow incorporation, that even no incorporation, that's typically where we see more of that issue come into play. And now we have inhibitors for that. So your urease inhibitors, like Agrotane, or there's a lot of now that have NBPT in it, which is just the active ingredient in Agrotane. That's been well documented that if you're looking at a situation where you don't encounter a corporation within 4 days, I mean, that's generally the window. If you get adequate incorporation, whether it's with iron or whether it's with water, if you can get tillage out there in the field, typically the urease inhibitors aren't going to be as much of a benefit. But if you're placing it at the surface or near the surface, maybe even with an inch shallow incorporation, it's one of the things you may want to consider. And so that's one of the tricky things with urea, and one of the things we overlook, I think, a lot of times. And it's one of the things, even with these fall applications, I think, where it's really coming to play. While we know that it does convert faster over to nitrate, typically because we don't have the effect on the soil biology, that volatility can come into play too, where you can gas it off and lose it. And it's maybe one of the reasons why we see issues with fall applications, that we have both of those come into play. So that's the thing with these. I mean, even with these inhibitors, I hear, it seems like a lot out there. There's some push to put a nitrification inhibitor on urea, and just magically it's the same as anhydrous, which the problem is if we have volatility coming into play, that's happening before that nitrification process. So it may not get to that point. So that's one of the general issues with it. Urea itself is mobile. It's a neutral molecule. So it can run off or leach depending on, you put it on frozen ground. I mean, it can go off the field. The solubility and the leachability of it, though, does work for us. Again, about a 1/4 inch of rainfall is generally enough to incorporate it. But it's just a different management system. And it's not that we can just throw both these things out there and forget. Because if you look at the data, the same rates of anhydrous versus urea, if we apply at lower rates, we typically see a higher yield with anhydrous. So generally, you look at it, we're being, it's just the anhydrous slightly better. For spring applications or in season, there's really little difference. So it really just boils down to mostly if we start timing it out, the farther we get from planting when we make these applications, when we see the larger differences of these sources. And UAN, remember that has nitrate in it. It's 25% nitrate. You can't stabilize that. So that's where UAN is at planting or later works better. Urea, spring application is probably the best with it, just based on the data. And then anhydrous, we have more flexibility just because of the products do differ.
Okay, well, thanks, Dan. We did have a question that comes in, which is going to be difficult to answer without having the context of location, but it's asking about the possible loss of urea that's strip tilled 6 inches deep as opposed to broadcasting in spring in corn. So
we've looked at some data. Fabian Fernandez had a urea trial. He had it across the state. So this is West Central Minnesota is what it looks like here. And if you look at the band application, it does look slightly better. It's not perfect, but it is, I think, a better option than a broadcast application. The thing about your band application with strip till, if you can get it at least 2 to 3 inches deep, the data that we have from the literature shows that the loss potential is relatively low. I mean, Brad, I think it's less than like 5% or so with those deeper incorporation depths. So it's just a question then, if you take the volatility out of the picture, is that nitrification piece. And I think it's a safer bet. Probably it's probably not the best, but if you're dealing with strip till, that's probably your best option with that. So looking at it, if we look at band versus broadcast, it wasn't a clear winner in a lot of the studies, but it still was better than a broadcast. I'd say maybe about half the time, or just maybe 40% of the time in some of the studies. So I'd have to look back at that data. It's one of the things we talk about in Nitrogen Smart.
So Dan,
the other aspect of that is to remember, if you looked at the precip minus ET state map that I put up there, West Central Minnesota, the Madison, Minnesota area kind of going north was the one area that still stayed yellow. And so that's probably a part of the state where you're more likely to not have issues with that. I guess from my standpoint, I'm really big on adapting management from one year to the next based on the conditions. And so if we're in a kind of a wet cycle and the 90-day forecast says it's supposed to be wet, I'd steer away from that. If there's, I talked about how much storage capacity we have in the soil profile. If it's dry, you're not likely to saturate or move nitrogen because you're not going to get that much precip before springtime or before the soil freezes up. You're probably not at as much risk of loss. And so it is probably something that needs to be thought about and a decision made on that from one year to the next. Again, in West Central Minnesota, it's possible that is an acceptable practice. I don't like that as a practice going across the southern third of the state, though.
So back to that study that you were referring to, Dan, did Fabian have a urease inhibitor then with the spring applied urea that was broadcast?
Well, see, we typically use urease inhibitors if we do it towards the surface, but that study wouldn't have had anything on it. Actually, they focused on instinct in that study. And what they really saw is, if you looked at all the data, I think, 2 out of maybe 16, 18 or 20 times instinct was better. 2 out of the same, it was worse. And the rest of the times it was all the same. So that's what's made me start to think about that. And some of the work I'm doing right now in sugar beets, I have both nitrification and urease inhibitors. Yeah, that's one of the things I'm curious about to see if that is an issue, particularly with the switch more towards vertical till in the fall, because if you look at the data, it's interesting. There's some data out there that shows the potential volatilization loss of urea, and the data is broken down by incorporation depth. So I think it's in 1 inch increments, and you see it at about 3 to 4 inches, essentially, over time. I think they were looking at this over like 25 days, that the loss potential is relatively low. But if you looked at the 1 inch depth, it was like 20% loss, I think, in the first week, maybe another 10% or so the second week. It ended up being around 35 to 38%, I think, over the 25 days, which was less than what the surface application was. But the surface application really had no loss, in that initial week compared to that 1 inch incorporation. So it makes you kind of start thinking about these processes that it's all water based. So urea, you have to have the urea dissolving with water and for some of these processes to come into play. And with urea, it undergoes a process called a hydrolysis, which is mediated by the urease enzyme that essentially is in all residue, and it's in the soil, but it's several folds higher concentration in residue. So that's why if I had continuous corn, I'd be more concerned about surface application, because you have a much greater probability that you're going to start undergoing the hydrolysis process, which kicks it over to ammonia, and that's that initial step where you have that ammonia generated, which can be volatilized. So there's some things that interact here, but the interesting thing is that shallow incorporations seem to be initially worse than no incorporation. Normally we say we have about a 4-day window. If you just do a shallow incorporation, you'll probably see some of these processes kicking a little bit quicker. So it's just a thing. These NPPT products, they do work very well. So it's one of the things that if you're concerned about it, it's something that you could look at. But that situation with the strip till where you're incorporating it, that's where I wouldn't worry about it. And if I'm at least incorporating about 3 inches, it's probably not going to be a value. But, you've got to count on weather. So that's when you got to make that decision, how well it's incorporated and whether some of these products are worth it in the end.
The simple farmer instructions on the incorporation part of that is don't use a drag to incorporate urea, use a field cultivator. That's really what it amounts to.
Get it deeper, huh? All right. So we do have a question. I don't know if Sue or Lindsay are on today. I can't see all the participants from a panelist perspective, but there's a statement and a question sort of here about the southern Red River Valley and the fact that they've got about 12 inches of water in the top 3 feet of topsoil, and kind of a question about how much recharge is going to take in order to kind of fill that profile back up. And they're suggesting maybe 32 inches in the season. And I don't know if either you two guys have that comment, or if someone else is on that knows more about water balances. Certainly we'd be willing to take some comments there.
Yeah, well, she's the irrigation specialist. She's going to know a lot more about that than I do.
So we'll have to defer on that, but it's an interesting question, and we see who asked that. Maybe I'll try to forward your email on to Lindsay and Vasu to get a better handle on sort of that question on hydrology. So a question that's coming here from a practical standpoint, how do you best adjust for variability in nitrate testing? So soil sampling, suggestions here, soil type or topography. What kind of things are you going to consider if you're out there looking for how much nitrate you might have in the soil, and maybe adjusting your management based on what you're finding?
That's a fine question. I guess the question, ultimately would be is what resolution of soil testing did you have? Did you grid test for nitrate? I don't see a ton of people doing that. You'd have to start asking why there's differences in the numbers. Is it random variability? Is there some other factor? Is it parts of the field that have poor drainage where it was denitrified and lost before you took the soil test? Is it an issue of subsoil water movement? Is it migrating from one place to another? The other thing you have to remember is that test only tests nitrate. It's not testing organic forms of nitrogen. So if you've got, for instance, a manure history, or if you've got a crop rotation that involves a lot of residue, so if it's corn on corn, it is possible that a lot of that nitrogen is tied up in immobilization in the decomposition process of the crop residue, and it's there, but it's not being picked up by the test. You know, one of the things that stands in my career is a long-running discussion I had with John Lamb years ago about a statement I had once made about farming being an art. And of course, he took great exception to that and said, no, this is all science. It's all explainable. It is if you've got a lot of information. And the problem is sometimes collecting the volume of information necessary is just not practical or economical. And so in the case where we've got a lot of variability in the field, ultimately we need to decide, do we have enough information to actually make management based on that? Otherwise, we're going to need to probably go with the most conservative numbers so that we don't end up losing a ton of money out there. That's just ultimately that's what it amounts to.
So we just finished up a study too a few years back that Brad was involved with. We were looking at like 5-acre areas and fields where we were soil sampling intensely in those areas. And one of the things that I was amazed with, that even with the topography differences we had in those fields, how consistent my nitrate values were. Because most of them were probably within about, if you look at a credit, within 10 pounds of each other or within a few ppm. So it wasn't as much difference out there as I thought. I mean, you could look at your yield maps and maybe kind of zone out areas where you maybe have some differences in yield, but I'm not so sure how much differences are. I mean, there's certainly some fields out there that be some variability, but I thought we'd see more differences in the fields that we did, and it just wasn't as much as I thought it would be. Not as much as we kind of see with P and K at times in small areas.
Yeah, the one area where I would expect to see a lot more variation, and I don't know that you necessarily had a lot of this in that trial, Dan, is if we got really high levels of organic matter, say 6%, and really poor drainage, maybe is an area we might start finding a little more differences there.
Yeah, you might, but the problem with those areas, you might see more denitrification. I mean, that's one of the things with organic matter is, they heard some talk about using that for maps for variable rate. And, the reason why we get high organic matter areas, particularly in our prairie pothole areas, likely is drainage, because there's not a lot of stuff happening there that's breaking the organic matter down. So it's just building, which would lead to more denitrification. So that's kind of the thing about it. It isn't a simple, it's why we don't have recommendations based on these mass balance systems where you have inputs, outputs, because it just doesn't work as well.
So thanks, guys. I do want to make mention that, we can only kind of graze the surface here with this discussion today. And I did repost 2 links in the chat. One, if you'd like to go back and do a deeper dive into some of the fundamentals of nitrogen, both cycling and management, there's an online course now that you can attend, the Nitrogen Smart kind of fundamental session. It's available. There's also a session up there on manure, but that's a more advanced topic. So please take an opportunity to do that basic session first, as well as all those things opportunities that Brad mentioned earlier, where Dan and Brad and others will be covering these in person in a longer format, 3-hour sort of workshop. There's a link there to those events. And so I encourage you to take the opportunity to do that. It'll be another opportunity to interact with Dan and Brad and have a discussion and get more questions answered on this topic of nitrogen management, which is pretty interesting. So with that, we did put up a CEU code here. For those of you that are CCAs and desire of some of the credits here, again, it's a half nutrient and half soil and water today. We had one last question come through the chat here. We'll try to take a couple seconds and answer that before we close out. But what do you think about wide dropping UAN and corn along the roots as opposed to side dressing in the center of the row?
Well, one of the things I need to see, there's been some talk about that regionally, about looking at how much water is actually coming off the plant and if it actually effectively moves the nitrate down, like is proposed by that. I mean, if you look at a lot of the data, some of the data that Jeff Fetch has had where they looked at really early applications at V1, V2, that there really was not a lot of difference between that. I mean, it looked like actually the Coulter injection was just about as good. So the issue with wide drop right now, it's kind of my question is how late do you want to go? Because we still see that it doesn't make much sense to go your side dress much beyond V5, maybe up to V8. I've seen some instances of wet years to V10 that, in looking at the just a surface dribble versus a Coulter injection, I mean, they're just really, I don't think that there's that direct or that big difference in terms of yield where I would automatically go to the wide drop. And Brad, you may have some comments on that because I know you've seen some growers that have used it and have changed some of their practices too.
Yeah, the one area I'd be very wary of is if it's corn on corn or potentially a strip till situation where there's a lot of residue in that middle. It is possible that you could be immobilizing some of that nitrogen at an inopportune time that could affect the crop growth. That's one of the areas where the wide drop concept, as far as getting it closer to the crop row, which is also more likely to be an area that was the residue was brushed away for planting, and more likely that it's going to just end up into the plant. Not even, I don't know really how much dew is actually coming down the plant. But anyway, so that's probably the bigger thing I would be concerned about. If you're on a kind of a traditional corn soybean rotation and you've had some tillage out there, you probably don't have that much residue in the middle of the row that's going to affect that. But I guess I'd kind of evaluate that from that standpoint. Dan mentioned Jeff did some research on that at Waseca. I really didn't see a lot of differences between splitting it in wide drops or doing a single dribble. Our opinion has been all along that it's a very fine way to apply nitrogen. It's a good way to do it. However, we can't find good justification to say that it's better than just simply putting on a single dribble band.
Yeah, and the only thing I think you might risk with more bands out there is some volatility. Just the more bands you have, you might see more volatility. I think some growers have went to every other row instead of doing 2 bands on each side of the row. Maybe I think you probably just need 1 band to the side of the plant. I don't think having it on both sides really has as much of an advantage.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. And do want to make mention next week we'll be back for a discussion on semi-dwarf corn, as well as some of the soybean cyst nematode breeding efforts and discussion on that. So that'll be coming up. The following week, we'll be back talking about biologicals. So make note of that. And then finally, there was a lot of questions today came in about cover crops and some of the impacts of cover crops and nutrient cycling. And that'll be a discussion on February 22nd. Feb 15, I'll be back on with Devlin and we'll have a little discussion on weed management. So just a note on the next few sessions there. I do want to thank our sponsorship here from Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. Thanks again, folks there with those organizations.